Can't hear you.
Jeannie, you're muted.
No, she's not.
Yes, she is.
No.
No, we can't hear you now.
She probably had the same problem I had. I had to go into the view, I think, or somewhere and try and set it up on me.
Well,
Yeah, well, I can need to call us in order too.
to keep us moving along, Councillor Driggs,
Present.
Councillor Clark,
Present.
Councillor Cook,
Here.
and I am here, as well as Solicitor Marcello, Town Planner Jennifer Siciliano, and Town Administrator Chris Cotta. Susan, if you want to.
Okay. Yeah, I'll call the planning board meeting to order for October 8th, 2020 at 7:02. I'll do a roll call. We do audible. Amanda Souza is not here. Janice Gomes is not here. Rosemary Eva.
Present.
Stu Hardy.
Present.
Susan Gill, present. Adam Raposa is not here. Dave Perry.
Yeah.
He's here. Peter Bramonti. He said he might be able to join us later. And Christine Shea is not here. Okay. All right. Yeah, and Jennifer Hugh. Okay.
Okay. So, so our agenda tonight was really to talk about the community comprehensive plan and just a little bit about the solar ordinance. But, you know, the comp plan is a big thing. And there's one thing that we wanted to kind of focus on a little bit, which is the potential for residential housing development in Tiverton. And we've discussed this a couple times at the council meeting with the commuter train, you know, coming from Fall River and what that potentially means for us. And, you know, Tiverton has an unfortunate habit of trying to shut the barn door after the horse has already left. So this is an opportunity right now to think about that and what steps we might take to make sure that, you know, the residential growth is balanced and is consistent with the comp plan. So I think Jennifer put together a pretty nice presentation for everybody. So I'm going to turn it over to, I'm sorry, Nancy, did you have a question?
I just have one question for clarification. What we talked about, I believe, at the town council meeting was the opening up of those railroad tracks from Fall River into Tiverton, ending at Route 24. Is that correct?
No, what we're talking about is the commuter rail service.
I understand that, but at the town council wasn't most of our discussion that opening up the railroad tracks for bike path or something?
Yeah, that was the bike path thing.
Okay.
But this is separate. This is the impact of a commuter rail station in Fall River.
And it is in Fall. It starts in Fall River.
That's one of the stops. It also goes through Bedford, but yes, there is a
Okay.
plan.
I just wanted to make sure we were talking about the same thing.
Yeah, there's a planned commuter rail station in Fall River. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to start the presentation, and then we can maybe talk about it afterwards.
Okay. Let me see if I can get this. Sorry about that. Just trying to get it to work. I will share my screen.
Oops. Oh.
Let's see. Let me just move this over. See if I can. Okay. All right. Thank you for attending the workshop. I'm going to provide a presentation, and then at the end, you're welcome to ask questions and discuss issues that have been brought up. And if we have some time at the end, we'll begin a preliminary discussion of the draft solar ordinance. The presentation will cover development pressures in Tiverton, particularly in housing, as Trish said. We will also discuss the potential effects that increasing housing can have on the town and how we can mitigate or slow these pressures. So Tiverton has definitely seen an increase of housing development. The most recent proposed concept plan was to build 180 units apartment complex on Main Road. There's also an approved master plan for 275 units off of Zusa Road. There's a 52-unit condominium complex on Main Road, and there's a potential expansion of Brookdale Seconic Bay assisted living with 30 units for memory care. So with all that, there's also some minor and major subdivisions throughout the town. The numbers also validate this perceived growth that we're seeing. Back in 2013, statewide planning developed population projections for each municipality in the state. They based their projections on the numbers of people moving in and out of a particular town and fertility and death rates. But they didn't take into consideration specifics like a new train station. The projections were developed in 5-year increments up through 2040. We can see that from the projections, Tiverton is expected to grow over the coming years. The rest of Newport County, so I took the numbers out, Tiverton out of Newport County, and all the number is going down. And the state will slightly increase. On this slide, you see the rate change. So the middle of the chart is 0. So anything below that is decreasing. And you can see the county is definitely, without Tiverton, it's all decreasing. And the state is increasing a little bit and going down, but Tiverton is a much higher rate. So along with the increased population projection, there are a lot of acres that can still be developed in the town. There's an updated build-out analysis that was completed in 2014 with zoning, the current zoning information. So a build-out analysis is the attempt to figure out how many potential housing units can actually be built in town under current zoning. It looked at all vacant parcels and subtracted the already protected open space, the wetlands, and the steep slopes that can't really be developed. But an important part that they left out was parcels that were already developed. And why that's concerning is that it could be a 100-acre farm that's considered developed, but obviously it could be turned over into a subdivision and there could be more homes. So they didn't count those. So when you look at these numbers in the table, this is really a floor. It could be much more. So we see in R80, which is around 2 acres, it's a little less than 2 acres. There could be 1,862 units of housing. And that is where most of our acreage for residential use is located, over 10,000 acres. So the, let's see. So the other pressure coming to the town is the future South Coast Commuter Rail. It's been talked about for years, but it looks like it's actually going forward. The first phase of the project is building Freetown and the Fall River stations. It's probably hard to see this picture, but there'll be 3 peak trains in the morning and 3 at night, and people will have an easy time going from Fall River to a job in Boston. So the contract for the phase 1 was just awarded this year in May and is scheduled to be completed in 2023. And we all know that there'll probably be delays, but since money has been set aside, it probably will be, finished, I would think. So now that we know residential development is probably coming to what does it do to the town? So it puts stresses on town services, and it can also change the character and nature of the town. The stresses it can cause can be increased amount of school-aged children attending the public school system and supplying necessary services, the need for increase in water and wastewater infrastructure, additional trash pickup. I know that you do pay as you go, but I believe a lot of those funds are used to offset the landfill. There's also electric cost of streetlights, plowing, maintaining roads, not to mention the increase of police and fire. You want to keep up with your recreational amenities with the senior center already serves 1,000 members. And the town provides things like polling stations and other town hall services that potentially would be increased with more population. So you might say, well, maybe we have lower level of services. Nobody wants that, but maybe you're like, okay. But the truth is there are consequences beyond just the level of services. It would actually impact people currently living in town without change into level services or lower in level services, because 40% of the town is dependent on individual wells, and they need clean, sustainable, amount of water. And as new wells are being dug, that's more homes, less water for everyone. So that would be a concern. And also, the town might have to put in public water, which costs more money. And also wastewater. Most of the homes in Tiverton are on individual septic. I know that there's a small percentage that is on sewer, but most of it on septics, which can also affect the water system. So it's not that we don't want growth at all, I'm sure, but we want to keep in mind, manage it carefully as we go forward. All right. So how can the town manage these development pressures? Planners have certain toolkits which are available to use, and some tools are good, some are not so good, some are lacking. But we could come up with more creative ideas as well. But I wanted to talk about these 5 and talk about the pros and cons and how they could be implemented. So there are transfer of development rights, rezoning for lower density in sensitive watershed areas, yearly quotas on residential dwelling units, conservation easements and purchase of development rights and impact fees, sometimes known as fair share. So first, we're going to talk about transfer of development rights. It is basically a market system to promote development in certain areas of the town away from environmentally fragile environments. So developers would buy credits to build higher density in certain areas of the town, called a receiving area. And in other parts of the town that are environmentally sensitive, where property owners have the right to develop, but they could sell their rights through credits, and that's called the sending area. And the town would develop a banking system for these credits. This program really provides money to large landowners to not develop property, yet the town will still need to deal with increased development in receiving areas. So there was a study conducted about transfer of development rights in Washington County And the General Assembly gave Exeter and North Kingstown permission to go ahead with this system back in 2010. And the state also tried to promote it by developing a guidebook in 2015. But I had heard that nobody was using this program. And I called the director of planning in North Kingstown to make sure that I wasn't just hearing these things. And she told me just last week, no one is using the program, and they're thinking about taking it out of their ordinance. So I just wanted to mention this tool in case you heard about it and wondered how well it works. So another tool the town can use to lessen pressures is to rezone for lower density in sensitive watershed areas. The town could increase some parts within the watershed to possibly 3-acre lots, sometimes called large lot zoning. There's an opportunity to increase frontage feet as well. That would also decrease some of the allowed amount of lots. So you need to be careful doing this sort of zoning because because of people's property rights and ability to develop their property, and 2, because it can become exclusionary. And if it's done incorrectly, it can prohibit people from being allowed to come into the town, which can lead to lawsuits. We don't want that. There have been suits. Towns have been sued for discrimination because of large lot zoning, but from my research, it looks like 2 acres is pretty much the maximum, and 3 acres is allowed for environmentally fragile areas. For example, Martha's Vineyard is mostly 3-acre zoning. So that would be something that we'd want the solicitor to look into to make sure if we went down that road. So another thing the town can do is put a limit on residential dwellings per year. And somebody said, asked me if that was really, you can really do that. And so far of what I've known, it's true. It is in zoning codes in Rhode Island. It was really developed right before the bubble in 2008. So I don't think they were anticipating lots and lots of housing permits. So they put their permit level high, and they really hadn't reached that once the bubble burst. Obviously, we're starting to have an increase now. So the number, the annual number and limit can't really be an arbitrary number that you're just like, well, I don't want any more than this. You really have to develop, tie it to the infrastructure that you need. For example, say you knew that once you got 100 more children in the community, you needed to build a new school, so you could limit it. Say you had 2 children per house, you could say there could only be 50 permits in the next 5 years. Something with an actual meaning to the number. The next thing are conservation easements and purchase of development rights. This is probably the best way to make sure that land doesn't get developed. But it usually, obviously, costs money to buy it. Grant every 2 years from DEM when you vote for the open space bonds. That's the money that Rhode Island gives out to protect property. So my advice is just that we should be talking more to the Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy, and that's really, we should be aware of when those grants come out. Because when I first started here in Tiverton, there was some money that the state had extra, and I had reached out to the Land Trust, and they weren't ready to go ahead with an application, and it was a very quick turnaround, and it happened like the deadline was very right when I got here. But it's always good to have something in the bag so you know that you could potentially use some sort of grant that comes up to protect space. There are also fees that can be used for open space grant matches. For instance, where I used to work in Foster, in each subdivision lot would have to pay a $1,300 and $50 fee towards open space, and that was given directly to their land trust. So last but not least, there are impact fees, and the state allows the towns to charge impact fees with two major caveats. You must have a needs assessment that is conducted every 5 years. That can actually cost thousands of dollars. And money needs to be spent in 8 years on whatever you said that you were trying to supplement the needs. So our town does allow impact fees, and they are paid at the time of the new building permit. So when somebody has a new home that's over, well, it's going to be over over 1 bedroom, they need to pay $2,980. And that is based on a needs assessment that was in 2007, only for the school system. So it was looking at how much the school system increase would cost.
Go to the school?
We do use it every year to pay off some of the school loans. Needs assessment can be developed for water, wastewater, police, fire, DPW. Have that. DPW costs, I believe these fees could be collected at the time the subdivision is created before recording. So subdivision developers could be the ones that are paying for this fee rather than a person just buying one lot, a dream home, and then they get hit with this fee. It's a suggestion I have, but in this slide, you can see how much we get. We don't get that much for impact fees. And you have to be very careful with impact fees because towns do get sued. And one of the big lawsuits in 2018 was East Greenwich owed $1.7 million. So we don't want to get into that issue. Last thing is action items from the comprehensive plan. I actually counted up how many action items. There's 127 different action items. And these are a few that you can read on the screen. So I won't read them to you, but they include reviewing zoning and water protection overlay districts, to reviewing impact fees. So these tools that I mentioned relate directly to comprehensive plan actions. And that's the end of my discussion. If you have questions, thank you.
I have a lot of questions. This is Donna. Yeah. I was looking at the development pressure in Tiverton, page 3, and all I could see, because of all the only information I have, and you said some of the information isn't here, because the quote impact of maybe a rail station is not in these figures. Am I correct on
Yes.
that? Okay.
Yes.
So from 2020 to 2040, we're talking about an increase of 966 people. I mean, that's not a big deal to me. I don't know what that's all about. Like seems, I don't know. I just don't get why there's all this pressure. And then, I mean, we're talking 20 years, 966 people. That's like 48 people per year. And one of the things that doesn't figure in those figures is what is the demographics? And then I looked at the Rhode Island population projections from technical paper 162 from April 2013.
Mhm.
And on page 20, I see Tiverton, and it goes down. It goes from it has a 5-year.
Yes, right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see it kind of goes down.
Yeah. Yeah. And finally at 2035 to 40, it starts out at 1.3, then
Mhm.
0.3, then 1.3, 2, and then 1.8, 1.3, and then all of a sudden it dives down to 0.6. So, and then I looked at births and deaths, which is interesting. The birth rate is going down, and the death rate is going up. So I don't know if there's all this pressure. The other thing is that when you intervene and put your thumb on the scale when it comes to people's property rights, you inadvertently cause other problems. And one of them is that sometimes the people can't use their land. So now they've lost the use of their land, their property, and whatever that costs them to own that, to take that away from them. And how do you compensate people for that? I don't think you do. I think they're just left with useless land. So and to be fair, I can see that in this, there's nothing about all the different units, possible units being built. The expansion of Brookdale doesn't really concern me because that's an older population. It's not going to use the schools. It's something that's needed for Alzheimer care. I believe that's what that's for. So we already have a lot of room in the schools right now because we're not growing, we're losing students. So we're also looking at fertility is not that great. So I don't know what's going on with that. And so we need to know the demographics. There's doesn't seem to be a shortage of developable land, but what's the plan? What is the plan for handling wastewater and soil management there? And if you're going to do this, I call it almost like bit money, like you're saying, well, I'm gonna, give you some money so you don't build over here. And I don't even know how that works, some type of chits or something like that. If that's going to be done, then you're going to have, if you're already having problems with soil and wastewater, it's going to cause a lot of problems with if you have density of buildings in certain places and we don't have sewage to that. You'd have to stop moving sewage out and pipes and water if you're going to start doing that, because if the building is out and those places are getting, okayed or buying that they can have the density, then that's one thing. The other thing is the 10% affordable housing. I'm just wondering if you don't keep up with the 10%, do you then have to pay a penalty where a developer can come in and go, you haven't kept up with your 10%, and all of a sudden the zoning is waived because you have to keep up with the 10%. And that could be anything being built because you have to make up for it. Am I right on that?
Correct.
Okay, so that's a problem. So I just think all of this stuff that the government's trying to do is actually going to cause a lot of problems. And I think the worst of it, when you start also limiting people, their right to build, where like there's some type of system, first come, first serve, you know, that's a problem because you're treating people differently about their property. I think that's a problem. And who determines? I think it also creates a system where there could be favorites, things being moved up ahead of others, and money being handed over so that all of a sudden someone that was maybe having to wait in 3 years is all of a sudden they're getting the okay. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but humans do what humans do. And if there's a way to make money, all of a sudden the people that have money can move their development up. Once again, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it kind of sets it up for that. And I can't go with that. I guess my thing is I'm not seeing where the pressure is. And one thing I have to say is, when you try to solve a problem, it then sets up another problem. And it's not a good problem. And the property rights is then the problem. People then have problems with their property. Anytime the government gets involved, people get, I'm just going to say, they get kind of screwed, because that's what happens. So, and the government is a little more powerful than the people, because the government has the money to tax, and they can kind of stop people from having their rights, because people, ordinary people, they just run out of money. They can't keep using lawyers to try to get their property rights back, or being, you know, not being able to develop their property because they're not in the right place in line to wait for these things to happen. The other thing that's not being discussed is how this affects, how these programs affect taxes and affordability. If you make it difficult to build single family homes, the price of single family homes go up. Now, all of a sudden, people that were in the market are out of the market. Now you have people that are affordable, that use more services. I'm just going to say it. And then you have people that can afford to live here. Now the middle people, or the middle America, can't afford to buy a house here. They're out of the market. That's what happens, because there's fingers on the scale. And I'm just afraid with this program, that's probably why this program isn't being used in a lot of places.
Okay, Donna, can I ask you to just wrap it up a little so that—
Yeah, I'm done. Those are my questions.
Everybody else a turn.
Yep.
Is there anybody else who's got a question for Jennifer, and then we can sort of, you know, take some various comments? Does anybody else have a question? Jennifer, do you mind going back, turning the screen sharing off, just so I can see who's raising their hand?
Sure.
That's okay. All right. Dave Perry's got a question.
Yeah. What's happened over the last year with COVID has stopped a lot of people from traveling to Boston. And I know the rail is coming. I've been saying that for a long time. But I think what's going to happen is it might slow this up a little bit, because a lot of people are working from their homes right now. And a lot of these companies are really liking what they're seeing, people working from their homes. New York City right now has 35% vacancies in their buildings. And I don't know what the number is in Boston because I haven't seen it. But I think the same thing is going to happen in Boston. You know, they're not using the parking spaces. They're not using their restaurants. And that's why all these businesses are going out. These people are working from home. They're not eating in Boston anymore because they don't work in Boston. So I think that might slow up the purchasing of homes in Tiverton. The other thing I'd like to say is we've got to remember that these three projects that are going on right now go way back to 2000, when there was no boom for building. I believe the state gave them a extension of 20 years with their property, so they could. They might have put in their project 20 years ago, and that same project is still good right now for 20 years. And that's why we're seeing all these people trying to come in and build right now, because their 20 years are up. If they don't build now, then they have to change the whole scenario of what they want to do. And those are only my comments. Thank you.
Nancy Driggs?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with a lot of the comments that, all of the comments that actually Dave Perry and Donna made. And I guess I had one just observation that even assuming Boston still is a mecca that's drawing people for jobs, there seems to be a huge assumption being made that everybody who's going to use this rail is going to move to Tiverton, and I'm not sure that's true. I mean, there's Westport, there's Little Compton, blah, blah, blah. Plus, I guess I was really struck that the total growth is 966 people or something by 2040. But I was very interested in when it got to the talk about the impact fees. Do you know what are the lawsuits about that are, you mentioned one, Greenwich, the 1.7.
Yeah, I don't think, yeah, so when they're not based on any sort of study, I can look it up. I think it was particularly about.
They have to be based on a study. They have to be, the money has to be used for a particular purpose. They can't be arbitrary. It can't be an arbitrary amount. You've got to figure out, there's got to be a rational basis between the amount you're charging and what the impact fee is. It can't be forever. So there's a whole myriad of, it came out of the fact that I think in the 80s, right during the building boom, or right after the building boom, or during the building boom, a lot of people just couldn't keep up with the permitting process. So a lot of towns put a moratorium on building permits, and that caused a whole bunch of lawsuits against cities and towns. And so therefore they came up with this compromise of impact fees.
Okay. And I guess just to finish up, I really agree with Donna that sometimes you have to ask the question, what is the problem we're looking to solve? And I'm not sure I see what the problem is. But you have to be careful that the solution doesn't create more problems. And I can see as this thing plays out, assuming we went with several of the options, you have a town of Tiverton that now has the super rich in one section because they can afford to keep their houses and pay whatever they have to pay. And then you have these new dense areas being created that probably include affordable housing and a lot of conservation. And the whole thing just strikes me as a little zany.
Steve Clark, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I did. There is, Dave talked about the effect of the COVID virus a little bit and made some good points. But something else to consider is that because a lot of people who can work from home now do not have to commute into the cities, that could put pressure on housing in places like Tiverton. Because now that you don't have to commute into Boston or whatever, Providence anymore, houses in this area could become more desirable. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on. I'm not sure how that's going to play out in the long run. I mean, in a year from now, this whole COVID thing could be behind us and it may have no effect, but if it's a long-term thing, it's definitely going to cause people to move away from the cities. And I think there's some evidence of that trend already. And so the railroad coming down the Fall River may have a lot of empty railroad cars on it, but that's not our problem. But that is another thing to consider that may cause housing in Tiverton to be in demand.
Anybody else?
I have one, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
It's going back to the impact fee. When we adopted that originally, it was for the schools, for the bonds on the schools. Do we know how close we are? Can we possibly start thinking about using some of that money for other departments, revamp it? Does anyone have an answer for that? Maybe the administrator or the council?
Rosemary,
all of the money raised must be used in the school system.
I understand that, Stu, but I'm asking, how close are we? Perhaps we could amend the impact fee to include some of the other departments that need it.
Well, I've recommended that to town council in the past without much success. One of the, our development impact fee only focuses on the additional cost of schools caused by greater residential development in Tiverton. It doesn't cover libraries, police, fire.
I'm very aware of that, Stu. I was involved in it. But I mean, is it at a point where we could possibly think about amending it?
Exactly, and to expand our impact fee to those other town services that are not now covered would require something called a needs assessment. And this is where you get into the tricky legal issues, because and Mike Marcello can probably address this better than I can, but I think most of the suits that people have filed against towns on the development impact fees have focused on faulty needs assessments. So what you need to do in a needs assessment is show on paper what the additional cost of a new subdivision will have on, say, police or fire. And that is very tricky and very technical and very difficult to do. And it took us months to get it done for the school system. If you recall, that was a good 10, 12 years ago. So I do support expanding impact fees, Rosemary. I've actually raised the issue with town council on several occasions in the last 10 or 12 years. But it will cost some money because we need serious professional help getting a needs assessment put together that's so good that it will not invite lawsuits.
Can I ask something from Stu?
Sure.
May I, Madam Chair?
Sure.
I just want to ask Stu, this is Donna, what you mean by increase impact fees? You mean increase to other departments, like I would think infrastructure and roads, or are you saying increase the money that people have to pay?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but the impact fee would be higher if we were to expand it beyond the schools into the other town services that new residential development impacts. So the idea is that for every new house with, say, 3 bedrooms, and therefore you can assume kids, there's going to be an impact on the town, not only in the schools, but police, fire, public works, library, senior center, whatever services the town offers. There will be a cost, and that cost should not be borne entirely by existing taxpayers, but some of that cost should also be allocated to the new family that moves in from out of town into a brand new residential development. Did I answer your question, Donna?
Well, part of it, because if I'm seeing that somehow, if there's more than 1 bedroom, and it comes down to, we keep talking about children, and the birth rate is down, and there's certainly not enough children in the school because we keep losing students. I'm just wondering, do the people that have 1 bedroom don't use our roads? I mean, they don't use the library? I'm just wondering, should it be percentage? And I'm not really for a lot of impact fees where it just makes it difficult for people to find a place to live in Tiverton. I'd like, maybe reasonable, but I'm just wondering why impact fees do not come into play for someone that has a 1 bedroom. They use the road just like me.
Donna, I know the answer to that because
Oh, good.
yes, the impact fees are only for the schools. So it would only be for somebody who had at least 2 bedrooms.
Okay, but I think, yep,
But it makes sense if you did all dwellings, that it affects the roads and the police. But
Right. I think
Oh.
that when it was built, when the impact fee was designed, it was only for the schools. That was the only impact that was calculated in there. So it was 1 bedroom. I do think a couple of things. First of all, the population estimates from statewide planning are, they are what they are. They do the best they can, but the world changes, economies change. They're not really terribly worthwhile to look at. I think the one thing that you see in terms of the rest of Newport County versus Tiverton is that, Portsmouth and Middletown and Newport are pretty much a build out. They don't have any more developable land over there. There's very small amount of developable land. I mean, Newport's basically at build out. And Middletown and Little Compton, Middletown and Portsmouth with the Aquidneck land, between the Aquidneck Land Trust and other land that's put into conservation easement, there's just not a lot of places left to develop. We, on the other hand, have a lot. And, I'm sensitive to people's property rights. We're not talking about taking away people's property rights. They'd still be able to develop their property. The question is, what's the right density in all of these zones so that we don't end up with more housing than we can support. And it's, the schools and the roads and all of those things that's an issue. But one of the really big issues, if the town doesn't want to be thinking about putting public water and public sewer in, is that, how much housing can we have and still make sure people have enough potable, safe water to drink? We don't have an aquifer. There's no aquifer here in Tiverton whatsoever. All the water comes from fractured bedrock. And our soils are poor for septic systems. There are other communities that have, in fact, developed land beyond the land's capacity to provide, potable water and sewer. And then you're looking at being mandated to have to put it in because there's just not enough there. I live in South Tiverton right now, and I happen to have my plumber coming, and I've heard from other people who have called me that there are any number of people right now whose wells are just not recharging because the groundwater is so low. I talked to Carl DeStremps the other day at Stafford, and you probably know there's a water ban for Stonebridge customers. That pond generally does pretty well even in a drought because it's spring fed. I mean, there's some stormwater, but it's primarily spring fed. It's down 20 inches. Well, it was before the rain, and it's down 20 inches because the groundwater is so low, the springs aren't feeding it. So I do think in terms of what we're talking about here, beyond, the impact for schools and everything else, is also the issue of how much stuff can you put anywhere and be able to have potable water. And if you go beyond that, it then becomes the town's responsibility to remediate that. And that's, sort of an issue. I agree with Nancy. I'm not a big fan of the transferred development rights. I don't think there's a ton of developable land left in North Tiverton. And I do think that, you run the risk that that you're pushing, things like all the affordable housing and everything into one place. As far as increasing the density, the zoning density in, the R80 to something else, or, in the watersheds to something else, I don't think you necessarily run the risk that you're creating sort of just estate properties down here, because, we do require that people do conservation development, essentially. so that, you may need that amount of land, but when the houses are developed, they end up on, smaller lots and or closer together. So you're not, just creating this thing where, everybody, if you want to build a house in South Tiverton, you have to have a 5-acre lot. That's not how it works. I agree that, no one really knows exactly what the impact of the commuter rail will be. I think it depends on, whether or not once the COVID-19 thing is over, people go back to, commuting into Boston on a regular basis. I do think, and Steve made this point, and we're seeing this now, if you talk to a lot of local realtors, and right now it's happening with the higher end properties, but there are people coming from everywhere looking over here to move here because they want to get out of the cities. They don't have to be that close. They might have to go in sometimes, but they don't have to go all the time. I just think that we should be looking at all of these things. We talked about it when we developed the community comprehensive plan to determine, what we might do to not let the residential development outstrip both the schools and the services, but neither let it outstrip the capacity to supply, clean water to everybody.
So I'd just like to pick up on 2 points that Tricia has just made because they come before the planning board all the time. The first is the lack of wells tapping into an aquifer because we don't have an aquifer. All of the wells, the private wells, bringing potable water up to homes are drilled into fissures in bedrock. And we've talked to experts, hydraulic engineers, and they say that no one really knows how water flows and patterns of water flows work under those circumstances. We're already receiving objections from existing homeowners who are talking about failures of their wells and are very concerned about new developments going in nearby. The other issue that Tricia raised that I think is really important is the fact that our soils are terrible for development. Our soils create real limitations on our ability to have conventional subdivisions. They're very bad for OWTS's on-site wastewater treatment systems, the individual septic systems, and we have very high water tables, and so it's a very technical issue, but it puts serious constraints on our ability to develop as some neighboring towns have developed. So I just wanted to make those 2 points. This is something that the planning board faces all the time. We bring the experts in, they all say the same thing.
Susan?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I think listening to this, I think something that might help, I don't know if somebody else knows, if Stu or Rosemary knows the last time zoning was looked at. I think that might be a viable approach to this if it's been 10, 20 years since the town was rezoned. Seems like that might be a way to look at it, and the uses that are allowed, like some zoning areas allow, like apartment complexes, and there's a lot of shortcomings in the uses, but I think maybe a reasonable approach would be to look at how we do some rezoning town-wide and what the uses are, to maybe limit.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, the last major
very large.
Susan, we're losing you.
Scale. Pardon?
We lost you there for a second.
Oh, I know, my internet's not great. I'm just saying, I think maybe uses and zoning are an approach we could use to look at townwide use. And that might be a way to, because if it's been 10 or 20 years since that's been done, we can see what seems more reasonable given what we know now with the development as it stands and kind of what we think some of the towns or the land use ability is to develop the land.
I completely agree with Susan. And I would also point out that our existing zoning has a couple of features that we can build upon, I think, to attack the problem of overdevelopment or inappropriate development. For example, we have 2 watershed protection overlay districts that relate to Nonquit Pond and Stafford Pond. Those were developed years and years ago, and they're very good, but they could be tightened, they could be analyzed, modifications could be made to take burdens off people who are doing relatively simple things to their property, but also address the issue of too many homes being built in areas with serious soil and water constraints. Another provision that we have in our zoning that we deal with all the time on the planning board is something called rural residential developments. This is a category of housing developments. Some towns call it conservation development, other towns call it cluster development. The idea is that in certain rural parts of Tiverton, when you develop, what you should do is you should cluster the homes together in sort of an old-fashioned New England village kind of configuration, and that maximizes the amount of unfragmented open space, and that has tremendous environmental benefits for habitat, for example, and water recharge and many other things. That has not been looked at in at least 15 years. We could take a good hard look at that and see if there's something that we could do there. And then the third thing that we could do, and I don't want to take away from Jennifer's presentation, which I thought was excellent, an excellent overview. I completely agree with it. But some towns have adopted standalone ordinances that deal with problems specific to their towns. And one that has been recommended to us by the NEMO program at the University of Rhode Island Extension Service. One program is a program very successfully adopted by Jamestown. It's withheld, it's survived a lawsuit. It's now become almost popular with developers, and that is it's called the High Groundwater Ordinance. And the Jamestown and Tiverton are almost in the same category when it comes to very high groundwater tables. And among other things, that ordinance sets a very strict limit on the amount of impervious coverage that you can have. That would also lessen density. Impervious coverage is building in a way that involves a lot of roofs and a lot of asphalt so that the rain doesn't penetrate into the earth. And then you have a stormwater runoff problem. So there are a number of things that we could do at the planning board. And frankly, it's been a long time since we've taken a look at any of these things in terms of what could be done to improve them. Sorry for my filibuster.
No, I agree, Stu, and I still do think that, this is just my personal opinion. It is worth looking a little bit at the densities too, to make, to see, there are some places, for example, South Kingstown has, in certain very sort of fragile environmental areas and places where they have a problem with groundwater recharge and wells, they've got a zone that's R200. So there are communities where they can justify, based on the lack of water availability or, poor soil where, that's just what it is because the land's not going to support more than that. So I do think it is worth, and not just the R80 zone, but, all of the zones, R40, R60, look at what's there and is it right? Or, does it need to be increased in certain areas? I mean, that's the other thing. And not that you want to have a bazillion zones, but, there are some communities that have looked hard at their land and gone beyond sort of the basic zones that we have. They have, they've further subdivided the town based on the geography and the resources. And, that's another option for us. I mean, obviously not spot zoning, but the potential to say, well, we call all this R80, but maybe we shouldn't. Maybe part of it should be R80 and part of it should be R something else. I don't know. Any other sort of thoughts from anybody? In that case, just sort of quickly on the solar ordinance, and I know that, it's ultimately going to go in front of a new council that's, not ours, so we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it. But I was a little curious about the solar ordinance in residential zones, because it does seem to cause a certain amount of consternation, and particularly with regard to, large farm properties being converted into solar farms. And I'm wondering if anybody on the planning board or if Jennifer has any other thoughts on that.
Well, I'd just like to say, part of why I know we finished it last November, we'd hoped to get it done this year, but with all the budget things, it wasn't able to come. I think part of the thought behind it initially, and it ties into this, is I know it's not, nobody's a big fan of it being in residential, but part of the reason that motivated us was, one, it would give property owners another use for their large farms if they're no longer farming. And also, basically, it ties up the land for residential development for the next 20, 25 years. So we saw that as a plus if we're talking about, the impact of additional housing, instead of, like saying a 50-acre site with a potential for residential for the next 20, 25 years, that would basically preserve that land from residential development. So that was some of the thinking behind that. But we're willing to entertain, the conversation of what we could do. The biggest thing I think that will limit it in the future, we've learned from the 3 applications that we've had, is basically defining what the coverage is. We went into this basically trying to design an ordinance in a vacuum. And the understanding we thought was lot coverage. We were using the old definition of lot coverage. So that's what the developers worked on. And it turns out that only the foundations for all the solar arrays are what counts as lot coverage. So they would never be even 10 or 20% lot coverage, when basically they would cover, 20 acres. So we've learned since then to redefine it as a solar array. So now our new definition for the coverage of the solar array area includes the panels, the foundations, all the way to the fencing. And if we do like 20%, like it would be in residential, it would significantly restrict the amount of solar that they could develop on any large lot. So that was kind of the thinking behind that. And we had talked about it in September that, we wanted to postpone the presentation at the workshop until the new council was in place. Otherwise, the workshop to lead into the public hearing, we basically have had to go through it twice. So,
Nancy, you're muted. You're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you. I just saw that. I remember one of the issues that came before, or at least that I sort of identified when I was researching before on the solar issue, was the lifespan of the project and how you get rid of, once, 20, 25 years pass, how you dismantle and what you do with the product. Has that changed at all?
I was on it.
Oh, what we did was we've required a decommissioning bond. So if either the developer is required to remove
She's allowed to
everything,
do that. I guess they get hurt. Huh?
the property to what it was pre-existing, like if it was smooth ground, or if they fail to do that, they default or they leave, there is a bond that we'll have in place. Then that, we could hire somebody. It wouldn't be something for the town to do. We'd have the funds in order to remove all the equipment. So we've worked that protection into, it's in the original ordinance. We've retooled it some for the new ordinance to make it a little clearer and improve upon it. But that was one of the things we definitely looked at, was to protect the town from something, a site being abandoned and left as an eyesore.
Okay.
And I have one other question for you. In terms of, farmland, right? Because the genesis of this whole thing was originally to help farmers.
Yeah.
So is there any provision in there that if you've got a farm that's a legitimate farm and you're allowed to put solar on the farm based on the fact that you're a farm,
Right.
what happens once the solar goes in if the farmer decides they're going to sell the rest of the property and subdivide it? Anything? I think Susan's frozen.
You did her in.
Jennifer, do you know?
Actually, I don't.
I'm just curious, because there, a part of this was to try and help the farmers originally. That's how it originally came to us, have the opportunity to put solar on their property, to help and maintain it as a viable farm, right? And so I'm just curious, if someone's got a large farm and does that, once the solar goes in, can they then take the rest of the farm property and subdivide it and sell it as house lots?
Well, I have to say that if they came in for a subdivision, one of the lots probably would have all solar, so that wouldn't be allowed.
Right, obviously.
If you have 20% coverage and you're using that for solar, you can't divide it.
Right, but if you had a significantly large farm property and you essentially subdivided out the lot that has the solar on it, right? You did an administrative subdivision, then you could take the rest of the property and subdivide it into developable lots, right?
Well, you wouldn't be able to create that lot, because if it only is 20%, then it would have to be 20% of that lot. So if it doesn't conform to zoning, you're really not allowed to make that lot unless they go to zoning. But right now, you don't have that, if I'm not mistaken, that the solar array lot coverage is not the same as lot coverage. So
Right.
there really isn't a limit. Like right now, the solar arrays that are going in are almost completely covered. If I like a Cook Farm, I went up there, but I don't think that would happen if you're only limited to 20%. Then you couldn't create a lot that's just solar.
Right. Although I think it is possible on some of these really larger properties where you could, still have a pretty large solar array and only be at, 7%, right? Or 8%.
Yes.
And in that case, In that case, you could sell off the rest. I was just curious. Anybody else with any questions or comments on solar? Chris?
So I didn't really get a chance to go through the entire ordinance. Does it at all preclude the town from utilizing like a capped landfill of putting an entire solar complex on our own property? Would we be limited at all with that ordinance?
No, I think the town had full rights. I think we were aware of that the landfill. So, yeah, I can't remember now. I haven't looked at it in a while, but it did have some provisions in there for the town that, yeah, even, I think it would be exempt from whatever the zoning was, because we realized that was in the R80 that it was allowed. It wouldn't be an issue.
Okay.
Anybody else? Steve Clark?
You're muted,
You're muted,
Steve.
Steve.
I remember some discussion about what happens when the utility system or the infrastructure has been filled to capacity with the output from solar farms, and how would that affect the town if the town ever wanted to get into the solar farm business and have their own grid somewhere? Are we somehow keeping an eye on capacity, and are we going to keep some capacity in reserve for, possible development by the town itself?
I think basically we've learned that we don't have any control over that National Grid controls capacity and the hookup. So basically we approve the design, and then it's up to the developer with that interconnection agreement, whether they get that or not. And we don't have any involvement with that. That's outside of our scope. So we could go through and approve if they met all the criteria and we approved a plan. But if National Grid doesn't approve it, they're not going to get it. And I think there's no way to get National. I think we tried, but there's no way to get National Grid to define a cap for any of this. It's really, the interconnection stuff is not something we have any control over.
Okay, and that's kind of a follow-up to that. Is there any possibility that the town would construct their own solar farm at some point?
It would be my suggestion that they should consider it. The offset of future electric costs for all our municipal facilities would be hopefully mitigated by the construction costs. So, obviously the financing of it all would have to be reviewed, and a whole package would have to be put together for the council to review. But I would not want to shut the door on something like that. I think it would be a viable opportunity for the community to look at, to utilize a resource like a landfill.
A number of communities have utilized their closed landfill, but the catch there is it takes about 10 years for the land to settle after our landfill actually closes, which hopefully won't be anytime too soon. It will be another 10 years or so before the land actually settles to the point where you could put solar panels in. We've been told that by solar experts who have appeared before the planning board. But down the road a piece, hopefully, that will be an option for the town, because it's been a good deal for other towns who have done that.
Even I was going to say maybe Bill Moore could speak to it, because basically roof solar panels go through the building office, that we don't have to determine those. And I don't know for all the buildings in town, the cost benefit might be much better to do roof systems, because I think we've learned, I don't know, but it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to do ground systems.
We
So
talked about this years ago, using the town's landfill to a company that came in, and they told us at the time that it would be the cost of to run it to the transmission line. It was millions of dollars, as Susan said, to run to the nearest transmission line. I think that would be your biggest cost.
Right. There might be a delay in getting the interconnection agreement. If you do the roof solar, Bill could speak to it, but I think that might be much more efficient. And then you could do it building by building.
the landfill might be out, it might, if we had it in the industrial park, that might be closer because you do have the transmission line there. But to run it from the landfill up close, it's very expensive.
Trisha, I have to go. I just want everyone to know I have to leave the meeting.
Okay, thank you,
All right.
Don.
Thank you so much.
Bill Moore.
Hi. So, so we could use some of the schools, the roofs. That's something that we could look into. The schools are closer for a better transmission line. I think Rosemary has a good point. The landfill is, the south end of town. But some of the existing buildings we definitely could use, and who knows, we could probably even use the town hall if it could support it. So those options are open. One other small point I wanted to mention just about the solar ordinance, and I know we'll deal with it when the time comes. Right now, I don't believe mixed use is allowed on the new solar ordinance. So, that's something that may stay or may not stay. But when you talk about a farmer, if they subdivide the lot off for solar only, then they're left with the other land of their farm that they can do what they want, in that respect. But right now, I don't believe, right, Susan, it's still, no mixed use, I believe, on the new ordinance.
Right. I mean, I think that's, it would have to be an accessory use to the farm. It's not, they could set up a commercial use. But I think, I'm trying to remember if we did work something in there that said that during the lifetime of the
Not sure if that's Susan or not. But she'll be back. But that's a work in progress anyway, but we certainly can use some of the town land if we wanted to develop some solar, and there are grant opportunities available. As you all know, grants aren't free. You have to work for them. And, we could do some of that, but there is a process, to get grants for development or grants for design and things like that. But, when you guys, or when the new council decides to adopt this ordinance, it would be very helpful from the building department. We are starting to get calls. There are developers out there that we're trying to hold off as long as possible without them really pushing back too hard yet. So that's kind of where we're at. And we're open to anything that the council wants to do to make changes or to keep it the way it is fine with us, and we'll work within those parameters.
Bill, would it be helpful if we had a fee structure within the ordinance?
Fee structures would be great. We would love that. It would be helpful moving forward. There's been some disconnection with some of our fee structures in the past, and Trish, I know you know about the building part of it, but the solar part of it was a little bit different, and the state didn't get so involved with our solar fees. So, definitely that would be something we would have to address for sure when that ordinance goes through.
Okay.
And, we're here to work with everybody to see if we can do it.
Anybody else? Well, in that case, unless anybody else has got any other comments, we can probably adjourn, but I do want to thank Jennifer for a great presentation and thank the members of the planning board to come. And I personally think it was a good start to a conversation for things to think about.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Tricia, I'd just like to make one quick comment.
Go ahead, Stu.
The planning board is tasked by state law with actually bringing our zoning ordinance into conformity with our new comprehensive community plan that was adopted 2 years ago. And let me read you something from our comprehensive community plan. The initial review of the zoning code will be undertaken by the planning board as the first and most critical implementation action following final adoption of the plan. The planning board serves as custodian of the plan, meaning the comprehensive community. So I would hope that this conversation tonight will move forward the process of getting the planning board more engaged in actually taking a good hard look at the comprehensive community plan and seeing what needs to be done to zoning to bring zoning into conformity with it. We make great progress on doing that with our subdivision regulations, but we have yet to start the process, even begin the process of bringing zoning into conformity with the comp plan. That's all I wanted to say.
Great.
This has been a great discussion.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. And it's 8:23. We can adjourn. I don't think we need a vote to adjourn, do we, Mike?
No, that's fine.
No, it's a workshop. So thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I thought it was a really great discussion.